This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This week, I'm speaking to Gwendolyn van Paaschen about the legendary garden designer, John Brookes. Gwendolyn is the owner of Denmans Garden and chairman of the John Brookes-Denmans Foundation. Gwendolyn's book, How to Design a Garden, out on the 7th of October, brings together a collection of John's works from across his lengthy career, disseminating the fundamental principles which underpinned his design work and in a way that's useful to both professionals and home gardeners. Gwendolyn is carrying on John's work at Denmans by opening the garden to the public, and as she puts it at the end of the interview, keeping his conversation going. I thought we would start because I'm assuming everybody knows John Brookes, but in case they don't, I wondered if you could maybe talk about some of the highlights that he achieved in what was a very long career.
What I love about John was that he was so interested in architecture and design and the land from a very early age. So it's no surprise that even though he was a Durham boy that had hoped to be a farmer, he ended up being who he is. When he felt he couldn't have a farm, he wanted to go to design school and his father wouldn't let him go. But his father did arrange for him to have a 3-year apprenticeship at the Nottingham Parks Department. The last 6 months of that was in the landscape architect's office. And John was in his element. He learned the trade of design from a man named Harry Blom, who was a Dutch landscape architect, and urged him to reach out to Brenda Colvin, who was working with Sylvia Crowe in Baker Street in London, to send his drawings down, and he ended up getting a job there. 4 scant years later, he was the first independent garden designer to show a garden at Chelsea. And it wasn't a garden about plants. It was a garden about an outside space outside an imaginary townhouse, and it turned everyone upside down because it was the first garden at Chelsea on Main Avenue that wasn't about plants. And he won a Flora Silver, although it was controversial. And if he were here today, he would giggle and say, yes, and it even had asbestos chairs. It was quite modernist at the time. And I think even at that early stage in his career, he was only 29, he had his sort of the core of his philosophy of design was right there from the beginning, and it just grew from there.
Yeah. So he has a very iconic book that, again, a lot of people may already own or have seen whilst they've been studying. Can you explain a little bit about what you've done with John's work and what's happening here at Denmans at the moment?
John wrote over 25 books in his lifetime, an unbelievable number of articles of all kinds. It seems that every designer you talk to has their favorite book. The first one was The Room Outside, which was essentially taking that first Chelsea garden in 1962 and telling you how, as a homeowner, what you should do if you wanted to use your outdoor space as an extension of your home. A completely new concept here in Britain, but one that was pretty well developed overseas, especially in California and in Scandinavia. And of course, he was so broad in his thinking and his reading that he was aware of all these trends and simply said, yes, we can do that here. So if you were an architect studying in the early 60s, you had a copy of his, or the early 70s, you had a copy of The Room Outside. This book is different to John's other books because it really is a collection of various things that he wrote. The earliest piece was published in House and Garden magazine in 1963. And some of them were not dated. Some of them were drafts. One was completely handwritten, and I have absolutely no idea if it was notes he took or notes that he used in a lecture on patterns in nature and in design. But all of them are in his very distinctive voice. And I think he goes into depth on his thoughts about art and the sustainability of the environment. He was thinking about this years before other people were thinking about it, using native plants, he thought very seriously about how a garden fits into its landscape, using the local vernacular and to preserve those cultural ties that to him seemed to be being erased by garden culture, television shows, everybody trying to do the same thing, the trends that went through everywhere. This book has lectures that he gave his students in Buenos Aires, or students or homeowners that he was lecturing in Japan or even Russia, and they're all applicable to all of us. He talks about learning to look, and he tells you to take your camera and go walk in the countryside. So what I like to think of this book as sort of, it's a pocket version of his philosophy of design and a really good companion piece to any one of his books.
Mm-hmm. And so you are now the owner of Denmans.
Yes.
So what's happening here in the garden?
Denmans had fallen into very bad repair because of a business dispute that John had with someone. And by the time he died, although he knew the business dispute was resolved and that he had control over the garden, it was in very bad shape. So we've spent the last 3.5 years restoring the garden and putting it back to rights. It's been a long journey in a way to get to where we are now. Garden looks absolutely amazing. You've seen it today yourself. I'm not making that up.
No, it does.
But it started off, I remember coming to visit in 2012 and thinking, boy, that is a really effective ground cover he uses, but it's everywhere. Well, it was ground elder. We still have ground elder, but it seems to be manageable now. What we started with was when he first got control of the property at the beginning of 2018, I left him for 2 weeks to go home for the holiday with a gardener and a shed full of tools, which they applied rigorously in that intervening period. And I came back to piles and piles of debris where they had just cut trees down and bushes and opened views. I mean, it was amazing. It was also absolutely terrifying. What one 84-year-old man can do with a gardener and a shed full of tools would terrify you. All the views that he opened and the things that he cut down now just look right. But at the time, it was quite a shock. It took us 10 lorries and countless bonfires to get rid of all the stuff that he had taken away. And the first year was really much easier because we sort of kept cutting things back. It was pretty obvious. But this year, it's been much more nuanced. We're working very hard on preserving the lines that he laid out on this garden through his period here. The garden, of course, was started by Joyce Robinson, who is an unknown but amazing horticulturist who started gravel gardens here in the 1970s. And he loved what she was doing, which is what drew him to this garden. But he's clearly left his own amazing design mark on the garden throughout.
You mentioned about him designing in the vernacular and how important that was in his work. And I wondered, reading the book, how did he express that in his designs?
John used the phrase, the garden in its setting, over and over again. When he was working in a new place, I'll give you an example. He told a wonderful story. When he first went to work on a garden in Poland that he'd been asked to design, he recalled coming off the plane and getting into the car and driving through this wonderful bucolic countryside with farmers and peasants walking through and little shrines on the side of the road. And he sort of conjured this very rural, bucolic vision in his mind as he's taking in all the details. And then the car swung into this massive circular driveway in front of this light yellow stucco Palladian mansion. And all of those the sort of visions had to be completely recalculated because now he was working in a very formal setting, but he still had to take into account all the things that he'd seen as so he could connect that garden, as formal as it turned out, to the landscape in which it sat. We did a exhibition 2 years ago called A Garden in Its Setting, and we compared that house in Poland to one he did in upstate New York, one he did in Patagonia, and one he did in Russia. And although you always have, there's elements of John's designs that are pretty characteristic, each one of them looks different. And the one in the Andes, in the shadow of the Andes, was most dramatic because he did these terraces, and the terraces are really jagged, big jagged lines, but they're reflecting the jagged shape of the Andes beyond, and he's connecting the landscape that way to that garden.
I mean, another thing that struck me, I think now a lot of designers still design rooms outdoors. And I wondered, because John had such a connection to the environment and obviously was very concerned about sustainability and wildlife, can you reconcile those two things? Can you reconcile having a garden where, maybe especially where he was talking about the smaller space gardens, and he was saying, actually forget the plants, start with the layout, and, you know, and if you don't want any plants, actually that's also fine. How can that work? How can those two concepts work, and those two things that were important to him, how do they kind of marry up, do you feel?
I think the underlying principle in all his gardens, whether they're large, small, rooftop, balcony, is that you have to work with what you have. As soon as you start to work against your soil or your climate or the environment around you, you're in conflict with what's there, and you're always going to be fighting that. So even in the tiniest garden, whatever you have in that garden needs to be something that will flourish there. Well, you know, so you're not going to do a butterfly garden in a pot, but you are going to plant something there that you're not going to have to throw away next year because it was unsuccessful. So it's broader than just planting for wildlife. It's about working with the setting that you're in and the vernacular around you, and what is a sustainable thing to grow. I think if he were here now, he would be thrilled to see that people are letting grass grow longer, but he would advise you to make sure that you've done it in a structured way so that it doesn't flop around and lose its integrity. That design has to come first. Once you've got the design in place, let it flop, but you'll always have that structure there to hold it in and make it a beautiful design.
That's really interesting, because I suppose you could waste more resources trying to achieve something that you felt was wildlife friendly when actually it's really not the right thing for that space. So yeah, that's really interesting. I wondered how, obviously he had this passion for garden design, and from a very early age, and you've gone through a lot of his work. How do you feel his style evolved during his career? You know, obviously it did, but did it change, or did it just kind of develop?
I think it must have done. I also worked on his autobiography with him, and I remember him saying to me that the 2 years he spent in Tehran in the late 70s, he had gone to set up the Inchbald School of Interior Design, taught him about working in another culture. And he would go out every weekend. He was in Iran, and he would look at what the textiles were and what the patterns were, how the landscape fell together. And that was all part of how he would have approached working in that culture. And interestingly enough, during that period, as the Shah regime sort of receded and the Ayatollahs started to come forward, the transition from teaching European traditions of interior design sort of gave way to, let's use what you have here. Let's use your own rich cultural heritage and work with that idiom in your homes, which is something I think he did very much throughout his career going forward. He had to do an English garden in Chicago in the 80s. And of course, there is nothing about the Chicago climate that resembles Sussex in the least. And he found that not only did he have to learn much more about how to do footings and the construction side of things, but of course, none of the plants that he could grow here at Denmans were even remotely hardy for Chicago winters and summers. And so it was that adaptability of taking what was around him and using it. I also think that when he came to Sussex, and this is something that Dr. Barbara Sims once raised in a lecture she gave for the Gardens Trust a couple of years ago, and I think about it so often here. I think when he came to this garden and he saw the naturalistic planting that Mrs. Robinson was doing, and he fell in love with that, I think that really resonated with him. And the way she used gravel made a huge imprint on him. I remember working with him in New York on a project, and there was areas where he also used gravel and allowed the plants to come into the design and soften the edges. I think that way of approaching landscape design integrated with the planting design was very much influenced by what he did here and the experiments that he did himself here.
I think probably he was lucky to work in other countries because it allowed him to flex that creative muscle, because he had the framework of the design underscoring everything, but then could work with different, like you say, the patterns of fabrics and channel all of that to create something that was specific to that region. I think some designers get stuck in a rut of creating gardens that look similar wherever they are. And it's often no fault of their own because they get known for that look. But obviously John just took those fundamental principles and then applied them, and as I say, channeled stuff through them. So that must have been a really great thing for him to do in his career. Talking of other designers, are there any that really embody his values and his styles that you can think of that are working today?
I think he had a lot of designers that he really admired that are designing today, and I'm not going to pick names because I think that would be unfair. But I think it speaks to the point that you just made about John working overseas. John could teach you how to design a garden, but he did not teach you how to design a John Brookes garden. And I think it's an incredibly important thing to realize that he taught you how to look. When we were doing his memoir, we reached out to a number of his students around the world, and so many of them came back with that exact thing, that they learned how to look from John. But I don't think you could take any of the designs that they do and say these are John Brookes students and look at his influence on them, in the sense that they were replicating what he did physically, but the philosophy of design that he taught was what permeates their work. And I think in the book, he names some designers that he especially admired. So you'll just have to read it if you want to hear who they were. What I love about the stories of him teaching overseas, when I was working on the memoir with him, I went to listen to 6 hours of interviews that he gave in 2005 and 2006 for their Sounds project. And he tells a story about being in Buenos Aires. There's a John Brookes School of Design in just outside of Buenos Aires. He's taking his students, from the classroom sort of in frustration because they're all trying to do, English gardens and European traditions. And he just took them out and made them look at their own landscape and made them see beyond the suburbs into the hills. What's growing around you? Use this. This is what you have. And he was very clear about saying, those of you from northern Argentina are going to be different to where we are here. And those of you from south of here will have to do the same exercise at home. That's really what makes a good designer, I think, is that ability to be adaptable.
Mm. I mean, I've studied garden design myself, and I see so many of those principles and ideals echoed in teachings from so many people. I mean, this could be a question I think I know the answer to, but how influential do you feel he's been on garden design in, say, the last 50 years?
Well, I'm highly biased. He was a beloved friend and teacher and colleague of mine. I think he's the most influential landscape designer because he loved to teach and he had something to teach. He would never say that he came up with all these ideas all on his own and take complete credit for them. He knows who his mentors were. He knows who influenced him. He was so fortunate to work for first Brenda Colvin and then Sylvia Crowe. Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe was a good friend, and they collaborated on work later on as they got to know one another. He had so many important and influential people in his life, and he was open to all of that. He just took it all and synthesized it and came up with his version of what he wanted to teach. And if he was in Japan, where there's a super strong tradition of garden design, he would say, this is your tradition. Expand on it. Work with what that tradition is. If he's teaching in Russia, where there isn't such a strong sense of garden design, he would tell his students to create one. But he gave them the tools to do that.
Yeah, I think that has to be the best way to teach, I think, because you're not, as you say, asking people to replicate your work, and you're not forcing or imposing rules on them. You're giving them the tools and allowing them to use their creativity through that framework. Also, beyond the realms of professional garden design, how much do you think he's affected the way that especially the British public gardens today on an amateur gardening, home gardening level?
Well, if you use your back garden as part of your living space, that would be the first thing. If you've thought about whether you want to look at the mower and you've decided to keep it out of sight and you've got your bins tucked away perhaps in a cupboard, that was a John Brookes lesson. He was all, what I love about John was that he was ever practical. Child of the war. He had suffered the deprivations of the war. He had been sent off to a farm when, his town, Durham, was being bombed. He'd gone through a lot. He just got on with it. He had that practical survival instinct, but he knew what style was. He could be completely practical and create the most beautiful things you can imagine. That's a gift. That was one of his many gifts.
Yeah. Well, I've come to the end of my questions. Your passion is clear, and I don't think that John Brookes' legacy could be in more capable hands. And thank you on behalf of everyone in horticulture, because I think, you're going to do an amazing job of keeping that legacy alive and keeping on disseminating those teachings.
I think the whole point is just to keep his conversation going. It's well worth keeping it going.
A very big thank you to Gwendolyn for taking part in this interview and for showing me around Denmans. If you do get a chance, go and visit. Thanks to you for listening as well. So, as if gardening hasn't given me enough, it's also cured me of my fear of spiders and, in fact, any other phobia I had of bugs of all shapes and sizes. When I was a child, I was terrified of spiders. I remember my mum and I running around our home screaming, crying, jumping on chairs, and then ultimately calling my grandparents, who would drive over from their house to put the offending spider into a glass and deposit them outside. When I began gardening all day, every day, I soon realised I was going to be really miserable and mentally exhausted if I spent the whole time running from bugs. So I gradually accepted them. Today, I'm the one who rescues ginormous spiders from the bath, but I don't put them outside. I relocate them to somewhere quiet in the house. And I found one inside a plant pot next to my desk the other day, so I tipped the pot on its side and I left the spider to go on its way while I sat in the chair next to it typing away on my laptop. If you're scared of spiders, I do feel your pain, and I know true phobias are unbelievably difficult to get past. But I just wanted to share my experiences to let you know how far I've come and maybe give some hope to those of you who aren't keen. So fair warning, here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about those 8-legged friends who share our homes.
Having friends who are serious arachnophobes, I'm very aware of the anxiety that autumn can bring to families all across the country. Since every year, it heralds the appearance of large, hairy house spiders that usually during the evenings scuttle out from the shadows, across the carpet, then disappear behind a sideboard, only to reappear a few hours later, motionlessly clinging to a curtain or skulking along the arm of a sofa. As we'll all know though, this inherent fear of house spiders is actually quite irrational, since they aren't trying to stalk or harm us, but they're merely the long-legged males searching for an attractive female spider to mate with. However, after 2 or 3 weeks, the males mysteriously disappear. So where did they go after their autumnal escapades around our homes? And come to think of it, where were all those alluring female spiders that they were searching for? Well, it's a fairly simple story, but probably not one that our arachnophobic friends and family might wish to know. Over that 2 to 3 week period, most of the male spiders would have detected the scent of a newly receptive female, followed it, found her, then mated and died. The mated females will then lie dormant throughout the winter amongst their untidy mat of webbing, while they'll have been living and growing within our homes for the past 2 years, covertly tucked away under furniture, on top of a cupboard, behind a bed, or beneath the floorboards, where they'll have caught and eaten various bugs, such as woodlice and beetles, that inadvertently wandered too close. Come spring, the female house spiders become active and start producing a number of silken sacs that they fill with eggs and suspend within and around their webs. When all their eggs have been laid, the females' lives are over and they crawl away and die. After about 6 weeks, a small hole will appear in each of those egg sacs, from which around 50 tiny spiderlings will emerge. These will quickly disperse around our homes to find a suitable place to build their own webs, catch prey, and for the very lucky few, become adult house spiders in 2 years' time.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.